I want to thank Alan Archambault for agreeing to do this. I did not know I was recruiting him to go up against the Seahawks. So, respect to you for not watching the Seahawks and for coming to hear about Alan and military history. My name is Walter Neary. I am the past president of the Historic Fort Steilacoom Association, and board member Charlotte Bash and I co-chair the 175th Anniversary Committee. We are having a series of talks about the 175th anniversary, and certainly this talk is super relevant to the fort's history. The one thing, speaking of 175 years, something that dwarfs that, I want to acknowledge that this presentation, wherever we are, unless you're in another country, we are in the lands of people who settled this area, in this case for 13,000, 14,000 years. And I on behalf of Fort Steilacoom, I acknowledge that the Coast Salish peoples have been guarding this land for a lot longer than 175 years. And we are on the ancestral lands of the Steilacoom, Puyallup, Nisqually, other tribes. That without further ado, I'm going to introduce Alan Archambault very briefly and then invite Alan to just talk about himself. Alan is a longtime military historian for decades. For 20 plus years, he was the curator of the Lewis Army Museum over at JBLM and always a devoted supporter of our fort. We appreciate him a lot. He comes with benefits because not only is he a very talented historian, but he is also an illustrator and artist. The slide that you see there, that fellow in bright blue, that is not a photograph. That is in fact something Alan drew, and you will see his personality and his historically based drawings throughout this.
When Walter had asked me to give a program for the 175th, I was reading through some literature on Fort Steilacoom, and I realized that something that was stated in several of the publications said that when the Civil War began and the regular army left Fort Steilacoom, uh, the post was garrisoned by Washington Territory militia. And I recognized that that wasn't totally true. I knew what they were trying to say, but I also knew that that was not a completely correct statement. And so I thought we could go over and do a survey of who actually was at the fort at various periods of its history, from its establishment in 1849 right up until its abandonment in 1868. So that is going to be the focus of my program, okay? I'll try not to go down any rabbit holes, but I also hope to give you a little bit of information about each unit that served here, that kind of distinguishes it or might be of interest on some level. So, as Walter said, of course, this land goes back and it was protected by the native population for probably thousands of years. Um, but our story is going to begin really in 1846. And that's when the joint occupancy of was this area was known as the Oregon Territory. Uh, there was a treaty between Great Britain and the United States that ceded um, the area below the 49th parallel, and you can see on this map here. I don't know if you can see the cursor, but here's the 49th parallel. Originally, the United States, when the Warhawks were at their peak, were saying 54-40 or fight, meaning they wanted this area as well. Um, but in reality, when the treaty was signed, a more reasonable agreement was made with the 49th parallel. Okay, so this area that we're talking about right in here um, became part of the United States. And I see Steve Anderson is on the viewing docket here, and I know he knows a lot about the British Hudson's Bay Company and the um, Puget Sound Agricultural Company and their activities. But when the United States was ceded this area, they agreed that the Hudson's Bay Company and the agricultural company could continue operation until basically they were bought out. Okay, so you had British-based company here in the midst of the American settlers. Okay, in 1848, um, the company M&L of the 1st Regiment of United States Artillery were ordered to go to the Pacific coast, particularly the Oregon Territory. And so in October of 1848, they prepared to sail from the port of New York. Actually, they were stationed on what was called Fort Columbus, Governor's Island, New York, to sail on the ship, the USS Massachusetts, that was supposed to also go to the Pacific coast. So they were going to stay on the ship the whole time. Um, in preparation, this is a document that I thought would be of interest to our material culture related people. This is to the commanding officer of Company M specifically that was going to be coming to Fort Steilacoom. It's kind of interesting because this is a complete list of all the items that they were issued. And so you see fifes, you see 60 haversacks, 100 stocks, that would be neck stocks to wear around your throat, uh, sergeant's coats, 75 wool jackets, there's linen jackets, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, they were planning on staying here for the long haul. So they were getting all the equipment and all the items that they would need, including 60 hospital tent pins for the hospital tents, et cetera, et cetera. So people have often said to me when I've reconstructed their uniforms, oh, they didn't really wear all that stuff. Well, they did. And we know that because uh, right here you've got for the hats, okay, you've got looking here, you got hatchet and camp kettles, etc. But down here's kind of neat. You've got 60 plates, that would be the eagle plate, 60 tulips, that's to put the pom pom in, 60 cannons, that's the cannon insignia, 60 pom poms red. Okay, so that means they're wearing their dress helmets or their dress caps, as well as the fatigue caps are being issued. So we know they're out here representing the United States Army with all its finery of that period. Okay. Now, they first, well, I should say, as part of their trip, they were on the USS Massachusetts, as I mentioned. It was a screw propeller propelled ship. And so it was really one of the latest in the United States fleet. So they wanted very much to get it to the Pacific coast. Um, However, instead of going around Cape Horn, as many of the ships going to, California from the East Coast or the West Coast, it went through the Strait of Magellan. And that was kind of a tenuous way to go, but they didn't have any incidents. It was full of little angles a ship could get run aground on, but they arrived safely, and they avoided going to California because it was at the height of the gold rush. So bringing a bunch of people out of soldiers on a ship to California in 1849, you might have gotten a lot of people that decided they wanted to go to the gold fields instead. Um, they did stop in Hawaii to refuel, and then stopped at Fort Vancouver or Vancouver Barracks, called at that time Columbia Barracks. Um, there had been an incident once I got to Fort Vancouver. Um, the citizens of Pierce County and actually the area around Fort Nisqually, there had been an incident where an American citizen was killed and one was wounded by Native Americans. And so the American citizens in the Puget Sound region were calling for protection. And so, basically, Company M established Fort Steilacoom in August of 1849. Okay. So this is the first, in October of 1849, the first post return was issued. And that's what this represents. Okay. They finally got to the point, they had taken possession of the Heath Farm, and it was rented to them by the Hudson's Bay Company, and I believe it was $50 per month, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, but here in the post return, you can see there's 76 enlisted men. Here, the list of the officers. Um, Major Hathaway, who was in charge basically of both Company L and M, came up on a trip, and he was shown the land by Dr. Tomey from the Hudson's Bay Company, and that's how they learned about the availability of the Heath Farm. Okay, and since there were already existing buildings there, it meant that they could move right into some of the buildings. Okay, and then of course they would upgrade them and build new buildings as well. As Walter mentioned, I'm a military illustrator, and this is a reconstruction of what I think Major Hathaway and then Captain Bennett Hill would have looked like. I guess this is Bennett Hill. He's got captains and bars, but this would have been the dress uniform of the artillery in 1849. And of course, whenever they were meeting officials, British officials, or anyone of importance, they would generally try to wear their dress uniforms. This would have been the undress uniform worn by officers of Company M during their time at the fort. And behind them, you can see reconstructions of some of the log buildings that were constructed by the men of Company M. This would have been the dress uniform of one of the privates, believe it or not. And this is the tulip. We're talking about the tulips and the plume. This is indicative of what they would have looked like on dress parade, which generally they try to do pretty regularly. If not every day on Sunday morning, they would have a dress parade. This would have been the uniform worn by Company M soldiers, enlisted men, while they were on duty. And of course, their primary duty out here was basically to enforce U.S. law. It was to serve as a representative of the United States government here in the Puget Sound region. They would arbitrate in all kinds of affairs. And if you study the historical record, they kind of kept a lid on things as far as relationships between the British and the Americans and the Native Americans and the settlers. And I often say, people sometimes question it, but the U.S. Army, the regular army that was stationed here, spent as much time protecting the Indians from the settlers as the settlers from the Indians. Okay, now from 1849, as I said, they set up the post in August of 1849. And up through February 1853, Company M, 1st U.S. Artillery Regiment, was the only military unit serving on Puget Sound. However, in 1853, they were joined by Company C of the 4th United States Infantry. And they arrived here with Lieutenant William Slaughter in command. And this is the post return showing their arrival. And the enlistments for most of the Company M soldiers were up. They had enlisted for 3 years. And other than the NCOs and the officers, and some replacements that had been brought in between 1849 and 1853, most of the enlistments were up. So the soldiers were free to become civilians, or those that wanted to re-enlist could stay and join Company C of the 4th Infantry Regiment. The NCOs and officers returned east to basically re-recruit the company. Okay, now I mentioned William Slaughter with the 4th U.S. Infantry. This is one of the only photographs that I know of that is contemporaneous with the period that uh, we cover at Fort Steilacoom. Now, this may have been taken back east before he left for the West Coast. This is his wife, Mary, and he actually is wearing his uniform. This is a frock coat, a dress frock coat. You can see that he's taken the epaulets off. He's in what they call an undress mode. So he's actually could these items here are brass um, ornament that he could put the epaulets on, the fringed epaulets. He's also turned down the collar of his high collared frock coat. And this is the hooks and eyes uh, that would have made the collar stand up. So this is in an undress mode. He may have just been married, uh, but sadly, he's not going to have a good time at Fort Steilacoom. Once again, I've reconstructed the uniforms because we have no visual, at least that I could ever find, of the troops that served out here. So I used the regulations and, of course, the items from the quartermaster stores. We know they were issued. Officers bought their own uniform. This would have been an officer of the 4th Infantry Regiment, and he's officer of the day because he's put his sash across his chest, which is an indication that he's an officer of the day. Normally, he'd be wearing it around his waist with the belt on top of it. This would have been an NCO of the 4th Infantry Regiment. At this time, they were using the Army regulations, uniform regulations of 1851. Okay, and they would have been issued these uniforms just prior to their departure. I should mention they marched across the Isthmus of Panama. By this time, rather than go around Cape Horn or take the Strait of Magellan, the practice for the Army was to let the people off, basically, and to march across the Isthmus of Panama. Okay, and they had a cholera outbreak during the time that the 4th Infantry marched across. And if anyone wants a more detailed description, U.S. Grant was the acting quartermaster for the 4th Infantry, and he had to stay with the women and the baggage until everybody got across. The infantrymen made a beeline to cross as quickly as they can, but the baggage train took a lot longer, and the cholera outbreak was a real crisis for them. But they did get across and then sailed up the West Coast. This is a corporal of the 4th. They would have been issued smoothbore percussion muskets, model 1842. And we know that there are at least 2 drummers in Company C because we've got the returns for them. So this would have been the drummer, and he would have sounded all the commands, of course, that regulated a soldier's day during the 1850s. Okay. Now, in 1855, we began to get into the problems of what became known as a treaty war between the Native Americans here and the settlers, and eventually the U.S. Army. Company M, as a result, they wanted to boost up the garrison at Fort Steilacoom, and so Company M of the 3rd United States Artillery Regiment was sent up to the Puget Sound area from the Presidio of San Francisco. Okay, so they would boost the garrison of Fort Steilacoom in light of the growing tensions. And one of the members of Company M of the 3rd Artillery, this is probably a familiar scene during the treaty wars. Everyone complained about the rain and the wind during that period of being out in the field. Okay, also, the Army had planned on bringing more troops out because of the growing tensions. And in January 1856, Lieutenant Colonel Silas Casey, Companies D and H of the Ninth Regiment United States Infantry, arrived on Fort Steilacoom. They joined Company M of the Third Artillery and Company C of the Fourth Infantry Regiment on Fort Steilacoom. This is probably the largest contingent of troops that were ever on Fort Steilacoom in problems, of course, with the settlers who instigated a lot of problems. It's interesting that really all the atrocities committed by whites against the Indians during this period, in response to the Indian attacks on the White River settlements, um, had to be, were really initiated by the settlers in many cases. And so the Army, was very adamant about the behavior, trying to control the behavior of the territorial militia, who were basically being led, or the head of it was the governor, territorial governor Isaac Stevens, and there was always a dialogue between, particularly Silas Casey and the territorial governor about how to prosecute the war. Here's a newspaper article from the Puget Sound area, and it mentions a detachment of the Ninth Infantry at Fort Steilacoom. We have been kindly furnished with a list of officers connected with the detachment of the Ninth Infantry USA, which arrived at Fort Steilacoom last week on board the steamer Republic. It should be noted that crossing the Isthmus of Panama between the time that the 4th Infantry came across in 1852 and the Ninth Infantry in 1855, they had built a narrow gauge railroad across the isthmus. So the soldiers of the Ninth Regiment had the luxury of riding a railroad across the isthmus. Okay. And it goes on to talk about Silas Casey, who was the longest commanding officer of Fort Steilacoom, basically got here in 1855, well, early 56, and stayed, with the exception of a year that he took a leave until 1861. Okay, now the Ninth Regiment, I should mention, was one of two regiments formed in 1855 under the leadership of Jefferson Davis, who was Secretary of War at that time. And what made them unique, the uniform regulations had been altered in 1854, and so they received new uniforms really based on the French infantry of that time. And they did away with the colored cuffs and the colored portion of the cap, and they went with what they call welts, because he had a lot of fading on the light blue. And so they just went with welts on the uniform, basically on the cuffs and on the collar. They had pleated coats like the French army had. So they actually had pleats along the skirts here. But the most important thing is they were armed with rifles. And in 1855, the U.S. Army had adopted what the French called the Minier ball. It's a conical hollow based projectile. And the U.S. Army began to design weapons that would fire them. Unfortunately, it was going to take them a while to gear up to produce the Model 1855 rifle and rifle musket. And so, in the meantime, they took Model 1841 rifles and they rebored them, put a long range sight on them, and a bayonet lug, which the original rifle had lacked, and issued it to the Ninth and 10th Regiments. The 10th Regiment ended up going to Utah for the Mormon expedition. And the Ninth Regiment, of course, portions of it came up here to the Puget Sound region, but they were stretched along the West Coast, basically from California up through the Washington territory. And unlike the other infantry regiments, like the 4th, rather than have drummers, since they're a rifle regiment, they had buglers. So they would sound bugle calls rather than be commanded by the drums. And I mentioned here, this is in 1857-58, Fort Steilacoom underwent a big program to build new buildings. And this is where, when the buildings that we know today, the existing buildings, were constructed. Okay. And so at the period that the 4th Infantry arrived in 1852-53, they were still living in the log cabins. But after the treaty wars, it was decided to build more permanent structures. This is the powder magazine, and you can see the cannons lined up in front of it. At this time that this photograph was taken, probably in 1860, during a boundary survey, you can see that they've got some mountain howitzers and some 6-pound field guns. Okay. I should mention that in 1860 to 61, there was a company of United States engineers in at who served at Fort Steilacoom. They had actually come out several years earlier and had served in a number of capacities. They had served in the San Juan Islands during the what we call the Pig War. They made roads, military roads between the various military installations here in the Washington Territory. And I should mention that Washington split off in 1853. So from 1853 on, Fort Steilacoom was in the Washington Territory, not the Oregon Territory. Okay. Now, what's kind of interesting is the commander of the engineer company that served out here was Thomas Lincoln Casey, the son of Silas Casey, who was the commandant of the Fort Steilacoom. Okay. We know that in one of the journals left behind by one of the enlisted members of the engineer company, they were issued blue Hudson Space shirts and white hats while they were working on the military roads. So I've reconstructed a member of, you might say, one of the road crews out here. Um, but they kind of collected at Fort Steilacoom in 1860, after the kind of the end of what they known as the Pig War, and they were here until April of 1861, when the secession crisis, and then of course the beginning of the Civil War, broke out in 1861. He was sent back east, to become part of the engineer force in the Union Army. And here's how the fort looked again in 1860. This is a reconstruction of how Silas Casey may have looked while he was commander in 1860-61. He actually, he and several of the officers wrote to the War Department earlier and asked that the whole Army be allowed to adopt what we call now the Jefferson Davis hat. Um, Originally, only the cavalry received them, but Silas Casey had requested that all the Army be allowed to wear them. So that's why I chose to show him with that. Again, we have no photographs of Silas Casey while he was serving here as lieutenant colonel. Of course, he went back east, eventually became a major general during the Civil War. This letter is from 1859, and he's writing about his tactics, what we call Casey's tactics, that was eventually adopted by the Army during the Civil War. He had light infantry tactics that he had developed while he was here at Fort Steilacoom, specifically for troops armed with rifled muskets or rifle muskets. Oops. And that was, of course, going to make a big difference in the conduct of the Civil War. Okay, companies D and F of the Ninth Infantry Regiment were the last of the regular Army units to serve at Fort Steilacoom prior to the Civil War. Okay, Silas Casey left um, in the spring of 1861 to go back east, but Company D and F were left behind. Company C of the 4th Infantry left to go back east. But the Ninth Infantry Regiment, it was decided by the War Department, was going to stay on the West Coast. However, they were going to be, the Ninth at Fort Steilacoom were going to be relieved because they didn't consider the Puget Sound area at this point to be one of the hot spots, okay, that you'd have to leave U.S. Army troops. They would go up to the San Juan Islands. A company would be stationed there. And in fact, one of the companies was George Pickett's, who had served out here with the Ninth. And while the Battle of Gettysburg was raging back east in July of 1863, his old unit was having a 4th of July picnic on San Juan Island. Kind of interesting. The other groups of the Ninth Regiment also went down to California because there was reportedly a lot of Confederate sympathy down in that area. So here in November of 1861, Company E of the 4th Regiment California Volunteer Infantry arrived on Fort Steilacoom. They were raised early in the Civil War with the expectation that they would be sent east to fight against the Confederacy. So you got to remember in 1861, most of the people who would enlist in the California Regiment were not natives of California. Of course, they were people who had come across to go to the California gold fields or to provide sustenance to people that were going to or supplies to the people going to the gold fields. So a lot of them had a vested interest in what was going on back east. However, the War Department decided that they would use the volunteers on the West Coast to fill in areas that the regular Army had left. And one of those, of course, was Fort Steilacoom. So again, in November 1861, the California Company E of the 4th Regiment of California Volunteers arrive on post. They weren't super happy that they were going to be staying on the West Coast, but they didn't know ultimately if that would be their fate for the whole war. I threw this in. I did this for Fort Steilacoom several years ago to commemorate Christmas at the fort. And we're going to be having another Christmas at the fort. I believe it's on December 14th this year. And at this time, of course, it would have been the California Volunteers who would have been celebrating their first Christmas in service at Fort Steilacoom. The citizens of Steilacoom and Pierce County were very happy to see the Californians. And in fact, a lot of the newspaper accounts mention how tall and strong a lot of these men are. And they're a lot taller and stronger than a lot of the regular Army troops that have been stationed at the fort over the years. And I think that alludes to the fact that Company M, and I didn't get into this too much, but many of their soldiers were foreign born. About 73% of the about 80 soldiers that were at Fort Steilacoom with Company M were foreign born. And the great majority of them were Irish, okay, followed by Germans. And of course, these were people who were fleeing the potato famine in Ireland or political turmoil in what was to become unified Germany in 1870. So, of course, a lot of these men wouldn't have been, excellent physical specimens, particularly coming from Ireland's famine. And there was a little bit of tension between a lot of the settlers of the Puget Sound region, who, of course, if they were American settlers, had come across the country, by covered wagon as opposed to going around the Horn or going across the Isthmus of Panama. And what they saw as these immigrants who were coming in, joining the U.S. Army and coming out to the Pacific coast. So there was some turmoil. Of course, the Irish-born soldiers were not big fans of Hudson's Bay or other British owned companies. So it's amazing that there wasn't more turmoil than what there was. Um, the Fourth California and other troops that were raised on the Pacific coast were, unlike a lot of the volunteer units that were raised back east, were initially just issued federal uniforms. Now, one of the things I wanted to make clear was there's a big difference between militia and U.S. volunteers. The Fourth California was formed as a U.S. volunteer regiment. It, although people from the militia may have joined, um, the militia laws only allowed militia units to be activated for service 90 days within a calendar year. So that meant when the United States entered the Civil War, you had the regular army, and then you had what they call the U.S. Volunteer Service. And that's when, under the auspices that all these primarily 3 year volunteer units were formed. So when the 4th California came up to Fort Steilacoom, they were not coming up as California militia. They were coming up as U.S. volunteers raised by California. Okay. So there was a big difference. They were being raised for federal service, not militia service. And that's why I wanted to focus on that, because of past uh, confusion about this. Now, the California troops didn't have the easiest time at Fort Steilacoom. Number one, they were not paid for 6 months that they were here, which of course, created lots of problems. There was also mismanagement in the supplies that they were receiving, and so as an end result, they didn't have the best in rations while they were serving here at Fort Steilacoom. A lot of it had to do probably with their command structure. Okay, and I didn't mention, but their captain Cronenshield was not probably the most capable, commander that troops could have had. So as an end result, there was tension within the ranks of the Company E of the 4th California Volunteers. They were eagerly looking to be relieved by some of the unit. And in the meantime, the War Department had authorized that the Washington Territory be allowed to recruit a regiment of infantry. But as might be expected, the population of the Washington Territory was nowhere near as numerous as that of the people in California. And so, as an end result, Washington was having a hard time bringing their companies of U.S. volunteers up to strength. However, they finally were able to raise enough in Company G to send them to relieve Company E of the 4th California. So this is a muster roll of Company G of the 1st Washington Territory Infantry. Okay, and they were replaced eventually by Company K of the 1st Washington Territory Infantry. And what was interesting about them is they were primarily citizens of Pierce County and even Steilacoom. So they were kind of local boys. And they were, of course, welcomed with open arms by the citizens of Pierce County. This is the commander. This is one of the few photos we have of Washington volunteers. Justice C. Steinberger. He was the commander of the regiment, and Captain Egbert H. Tucker, who commanded Company K, who was the latter company to come to Fort Steilacoom. He had been the Pierce County Sheriff prior to being commissioned as commander of Company K. Once again, the 1st Washington Volunteers were issued federal uniforms. Okay, now in March 1865, the Company K of the 1st Washington Volunteers is replaced by Company G of the 1st Regiment Oregon Volunteer Infantry. Okay, now the reason it took so long for any Oregonian units to come up here was that initially the War Department had only called upon Oregon to raise a regiment of cavalry. However, in 1864, they were authorized to raise a company of infantry, and eventually Company G was sent up here to relieve Company K at Fort Steilacoom. Again, they were issued the federal uniforms that we're all familiar with during the Civil War. Okay, so Company G of the 1st Oregon Volunteer Infantry was only here for several months. Eventually, of course, the Civil War ended in April of 1865, and the 1st Oregon, since they were raised so late in the war, basically didn't finish service until 1866. However, they were organized down in Fort Vancouver. So in November of 1865, Company F of the 14th Regiment United States Infantry comes out to the Pacific Coast, and Company F is sent to garrison Fort Steilacoom. Now, I should mention that when the Civil War ended in April of 1865, the 14th Regiment of U.S. Infantry was in Richmond. They had fought in most of the major campaigns of the Eastern Theater with the Army of the Potomac. They had served in the 5th Army Corps. So they had been in Antietam, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Petersburg, etc. Now, the men who had enlisted in the regular army during the war, many of them thought, well, we're enlisting in the U.S. Army rather than state regiments in the volunteer service, but probably when the war ends, we'll still be able to get out. Well, think again. If your 3-year enlistment was not up, you were still in the regular army. So the 14th members of the 14th Regiment and other U.S. Army regular infantry regiments watched all these volunteer units go home, but they were in it for the long haul. So men who still had time in their enlistments were obligated to go wherever the Army sent them. So there were a lot of unhappy campers, as they say, and they claim that about 250 members of the 14th Regiment decided they didn't want to go to the Pacific Coast and deserted. Nevertheless, the rest of the regiment did make it out to the Pacific Coast, and Company F was sent to Fort Steilacoom. So here we have kind of a different development in that we have soldiers that have served in big battles on the West Coast, on the East Coast during the Civil War, now headed out to the West Coast. So quite a difference. Before we had troops heading east to fight. Now we have troops that are returning to the Pacific Coast. Some of the NCOs and officers obviously had seen service perhaps out here previously. I put this up. This is kind of interesting. This is a notice from Fort Steilacoom and in the local paper about deserters. And one of them here, we have Patrick Fagan, age 21 years, 5 feet 6 inches in height, fair complexion, gray eyes, brown hair, smooth face, little or no beard, does not look like an Irishman. I'm not quite sure what they mean by that. But he said he's a good looking young man, a little ruddy in complexion, born in Ireland, deserted March 10th, 1866. Uh, so we see that, life wasn't completely great at the fort, but overall, their tour here of just under a year was not um, typical of problems that they would have with Native Americans or with the British. It was pretty tame. However, down at the bottom here, there's also another interesting thing, and that is a proposal for keeping insane and idiotic persons. And basically, it's requesting sealed proposals be received um, for keeping people who had mental illness here in the territory. And it's kind of a precursor to the fact that Western State Hospital would eventually be established on the grounds of Fort Steilacoom. All right, so in October 1866, Battery or Company E, it went by both, 2nd Regiment United States Artillery arrives on Fort Steilacoom from San Juan Island. Okay, so this is another unit that had served throughout the Civil War. Many of its personnel may have served in the major battles, although again, they did get recruits too. Um, but they are relieving the men of the 14th Infantry Regiment here. And here's the a little statement that's on the post return. Said left the island of San Juan, Washington Territory, October 10th, 1866, and arrived at Fort Steilacoom October 11th, 1866. Relieved Captain Keisler, 2nd Battalion, 14th Infantry, who left with his company for Fort Vancouver, Washington Territory, October 15th, 1866. So you see, there's always a little bit of overlap as these units are coming in, to get the new unit settled in. Now, the reason, I'll get to that in a minute. This is kind of interesting, and I thought some of our material culture people would be interested. There's a government sale to be sold at public auction, and these are all the items that were being used at Fort Steilacoom by the various troops that were here and were left behind. Okay, so there's all kinds of things. There's 75 cords of oak wood. There's bedsteads iron. There's tables, washstands, blankets, and it lists the number that are available. And these were going to be sold at auction because they were looking at closing down the post. What's kind of interesting to me, with the uniforms, is as government clothing. Great coats infantry, 5. Wall tent fly, 1. Blankets woolen, 4. Drawers pairs, 150. A Sibley tent, 1. Bootees infantry pairs, 168. Boy, wouldn't you love to be able to bid on those? Now, the reason they're selling everything is because, as we mentioned, they're closing the installation. And in March 1868 is the last return issued from Fort Steilacoom, and these would go to the War Department eventually, by Captain Charles H. Pierce. And it's kind of interesting. Charles H. Pierce had served with Company A engineers here on the West Coast prior to the Civil War. He had gone back east, as the Company A of the engineers did, ended up getting a commission. He had been an enlisted man. He ends up getting a commission, fights in the Civil War, and is promoted to captain during the Civil War. So he's in charge of Company E, 2nd Regiment, United States Artillery. Now, what's interesting on theirs is that record of events. Post visited and inspection by Brevet Colonel G.W. Foster, USA, acting quartermaster, Department of Pacific, for the purpose of evacuating Fort Steilacoom, Washington Territory, and establishing posts at Fort Tongass and Fort Wrangell, Alaska, in compliance with General Order Number 6, Headquarters, Military District of the Pacific, February 18th, 1868. So basically, they're being sent to Alaska to establish two installations. And here they're being issued all kinds of uniform items and equipment in order to go to Alaska. Okay, and here's where Fort Tongass is located. And there's kind of an interesting photograph from Fort Tongass. And there you can see one of the mountain howitzers that the second artillery had brought up to Alaska with them. And here's Fort Wrangell, a photograph of from Fort Wrangell, and here's its location in Alaska. So you can see from the period of 1849 and the establishment of Fort Steilacoom right up until its abandonment in 1868, its decommission, with the troops going up to Alaska, it's always on the cutting edge of the frontier, as it was, the Pacific frontier, both in the Washington Territory, and then it ends up sending troops up to Alaska. I will mention two other things. We've talked about the fact that we had artillery units, infantry units, an engineer company here, but we also have a representative of the Ordnance Corps, and that would be in the form of our ordnance sergeant. And we had an ordnance sergeant, William Archibald, and he came to Fort Steilacoom in 1853 as an NCO in the 4th Infantry Regiment. In 1856, he is appointed the Ordnance Sergeant, and that is a position that's under the Ordnance Corps, and they serve with the installation. Whatever unit comes in, they're under them for administrative purposes, but they are in charge of the ordnance stores on the installation. They could not be court-martialed. They could only be released from the service. And this kept them from being bullied by any of the commanders of the installation that wanted to take a cannon with them or something. They are the person who is responsible for the ordnance stores. And so he's re-enlisting here. He's being re-enlisted as the ordnance sergeant. So he stays with Fort Steilacoom. This is a generic picture of an ordnance sergeant he's actually on the post from 1853, but he's ordnance sergeant from 1856 to the 1866. And he loads the Company F of the 2nd Artillery on the ship going to Alaska. In the process, he has an obstruction in his bowels and he dies on Fort Steilacoom, the last soldier on the installation, in April of 1866. So he not only closed out the installation with the property, but he also closed it out with his life. And he's listed as a casualty. And his wife, who had been on Fort Steilacoom, can get a pension. The only other person I'll mention is a representative of the Medical Corps, and that's Dr. George Suckley. And he served on Fort Steilacoom. He also served on the Railroad Survey. But what's interesting about him is he was a co-author of the Natural History of the Washington Territory because of his interest in his service here in the Northwest. And I like to think of all the things he named. A bumblebee that was native to this area was named after him. But also he chronicled all the animals that he saw, while he was serving here in the Washington Territory. And I include this as my last slide because these are mice and a rabbit that he documented on Fort Steilacoom during his service here. So I like to think that the descendants of these animals are still on Fort Steilacoom today. So that ends my presentation. I hope I clarified, some of the units that served here through the years.
Okay, you mentioned near the end that an ordnance sergeant he closed the fort and died there. What was his
Right.
name and when did he die?
He died in April of 186. I'm sorry, I might have said 68. He died right after he got the ships loaded. The artillery company was going to Alaska, but his name was William Archbold, and that's Archbold. So he was the oldest man on the fort too. Although I've run into several items that gave different birth dates, but he was probably around in his 60s. I don't know if you're familiar with ordnance sergeants, but you had to be in the army. I believe it was 8 years, and I think five of which you had to be an NCO before you could be nominated to be an ordnance sergeant. And it was you were given the rank by the ordnance department. So it was a office of great importance to an installation. And you'll see he's on every just about every post return um, from 1856 where he's holding that position. They'll have him as it's the ordnance sergeant and the medical staff. So they're the constant there. They're not holding to the units that are there. They work with the units that are there, but they retain control over the ordnance stores. And they couldn't, as I said, they couldn't be bullied. That's one of the anyone who served in the army knows about property and the problems you can have with such. People are always pulling shenanigans. He had the responsibility for it. So, in several of the inspections of the fort, one of the things that the inspector general said, they've got a good ordnance sergeant. That was a real plus for Fort Steilacoom because he was the continuity. As all these units are coming and going, he's providing the continuity about the property that's there. And in
We're
the
giving some, oh, sorry.
right, the physical things. And in the absence of officers, he takes on more responsibility to close out like the installation. And that goes for any installation. You'll find installations back east, some of the big forts, like the masonry forts and everything, where the ordnance sergeant's the only guy on the installation, by the end of its service. So this was, something that had great importance to the installation. And I've got all the things. They think he died of what we call today diverculitis, which is basically an obstruction in your bowels or something and you get an infection and you die. So he had a bad stomach ache when he came back from loading the ships, and they said he had to walk to the ports, which was about 2 miles from the fort. So I guess his physical training regimen wasn't good, but they said that owing to his age and condition, it led to his death. So his widow could claim, that it was on active, it was part of active duty.
Do we know where he's buried?
Yeah, I believe he's buried at the Presidio of San Francisco. He was
Okay, that would
originally
make, yeah.
buried, yeah, he was buried originally on Fort Steilacoom, and then when they moved all the graves to the bodies to the Presidio.
Right. Okay. Gideon, you had a uniform question?
Yeah, I don't know. Let's see. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah,
I can hear you. Go for it.
Yay, it's working. Yeah, I just had a question, Alan. Noticed on your drawings the difference in the length of the plume on the shakos between artillery and infantry.
yeah.
Was was it a thing that artillery had a
Well,
taller plume,
well,
or was that?
yeah. Evidently, yeah. They were because the when I'm showing the fourth, I'm showing that pom pom
Hmm.
that's under the 1854 regulations.
Okay, so it's a change in regulation.
Yeah, when Company M came out here, what were they under the 1833 or something?
Hmm.
See, they were the earlier regulations. And according to
Okay.
what I had, they had that longer plume for full dress.
Alrighty, so it was a revised regulation. It
Yeah,
went to the
yeah.
shorter
So,
pom pom.
right. So and in fact, if I had done an illustration of, which I didn't yet, I think I probably should at some point, of Company M of the Third Artillery who got here later, they would have had the shorter red pom pom. The illustration I do have, he's wearing the rain cover on the hat. If you,
Sure.
yeah.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank
Well,
you.
that's at least. I mean, I am not without mistakes on some of these, but I think I tried to follow pretty much what the regulations said.
I noticed one of our commentators said, I have two, let's see, what was it? I'm a fan of Alan's illustrations. I have two coloring books and would love to find prints of it eventually. Thanks again. There's a lot of thank yous in here,
Oh,
by
that's
the
good.
way,
Oh,
by
that's good.
Alan.
I appreciate that. I
Let's
kind of
see.
winged it. Yeah.
What's that?
I kind of winged it. I don't work off a script very much, so I kind of do flow of conscious when I look at, see the slide and then just work off it.
Let's see here. So Steve Anderson had a comment slash question. And speaking of historians who are artists, Steve, take the mic.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
I can
Yes.
hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, I've studied, of course, the Hudson's Bay Company people, and one of the guys I really got into was this Angus MacDonald who ran Fort Colville. And I
Mm,
noticed in one of his little adventures during the Pig War episode, he ended up at Fort Steilacoom, and all he says, or all Huggins says about, or Edward Huggins says about it, is he challenged one of the officers to a duel.
excellent.
To the death. And I was wondering, Alan, if you or anybody on the chat here knows of one of the one of the officers there that was so anti-British or anti-Hudson's Bay or whatever that would have accepted that duel. Apparently, it didn't happen, but
Yeah.
it got heated apparently at one point.
Yeah, no, I've never come across that. That's interesting. I would think, that there were certainly officers like Pickett that would have taken him up on it, kind of the hotheads, of
Yeah.
which there were several. Um, but I don't know offhand. I mean, there were a lot of things I could have gone down the rabbit hole, as you know, on a lot of the officers and men that served there. And there was some pretty colorful people.
Well, before Stephen, and I think Stephen, I'd love to hear Stephen Allen talk for like 2 hours, and I'm going to stay
Well,
on for
Steve,
that.
I should mention Steve is also a former curator at Fort Nisqually and other places.
I,
Also an artist and a researcher. So, uh,
yeah, I'm
yeah.
not kidding. I'm here for 2 hours, whatever. But before that, we do
Thankfully,
have a
Steve,
couple
we're
other
not
questions.
both on Fort Steilacoom. You've got Fort Nisqually and I got Steilacoom covered,
I got to
right?
I
cover
know, but
this.
the connection actually is pretty severe. Even in the 60s, I'm doing a series of letters right now, and the guys that got moved to Wrangell are still communicating with Huggins at Fort
Oh,
Nisqually.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Personal
yeah.
Fascinating.
letters. They're sending him letters saying, "Hey, we're up here. It's cold. And don't like it."
Well, I
It's
didn't I didn't get into it, but Captain Pierce um, evidently had a problem with alcohol. And if you're going to have one, going up to Alaska is probably, going to exacerbate any loneliness. And he got relieved eventually.
Mm.
And he wrote to Ulysses S. Grant, you know, mea culpa, I'm sorry, my record was flawless. I served in all these battles in the Civil War. And Grant reinstated him. And what I read is said, who better than Grant to chime in, on a guy that had problems with alcohol and understood that it didn't, he really didn't have a record of being inebriated on duty.
You almost wonder who didn't have a record. I mean, we talk about Couch, some of these. But before we get into that, before you guys keep going, I just want to interrupt the Alan and Steve for a sec for two questions that came in. Gary asks if some soldiers were reinterred in California about 1869, who are the people now listed as buried at Fort Steilacoom?
Nobody, right? I mean, none of the soldiers are.
None of the soldiers. Yeah, it's the civilians. It was the
Very-
burial ground
Yeah.
for also the town of Steilacoom, if you don't mind me jumping in. I know
No,
this
no, by
because
all means.
my
No.
living history character has two children who are still there, and then there are some other, local celebrities, if you will. That cemetery has taken a lot of damage, like a lot of cemeteries. Most of the stones are
Right.
gone, but there's a pretty good number of folks still there. More for you, Alan. A question was, can you ask for me as a novice beginning education to speak more to the differences for trainings between volunteers and militia? So I guess what at a high level, what's the difference in how these various groups were trained?
Okay. Once again, the U.S. Volunteer Service is only in play when there's a national emergency, like the Civil War, for example, because they knew they couldn't count on the militia. Because the militia are sort of self-regulated. They come under the territorial governor or the governor of a state. So they don't get in the 19th century, they didn't get a whole lot of training. And remember, they can only be called up for 90 days. Okay. So the U.S. volunteer force that was created during the Civil War um, followed more the regular Army training. Okay. And they're in it for the long haul. Again, it was 3 years or the duration, whichever came first. And for a lot of the volunteer units in the Civil War back east that were raised in 1861, their enlistments were coming due in the spring of 1864, creating a real crisis. And they with all kinds of incentives for these men to reenlist because the U.S. government, much to their credit, was going to honor 3 years or the duration, whatever came first. And they offered, leave for these men to go home if they reenlisted, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, the U.S. volunteers were trained a lot more stringent.
Were there a lot of soldiers that just stayed in Washington Territory and homesteaded?
Yes, I mean there were,
No,
and
Grieg did.
yeah, yeah, there were several. When I did an article about the Irish at Fort Steilacoom, and there was a handful of them that did. And one of them went to work for Hudson's Bay, like he was a carpenter.
Yeah, he built the Factor's house.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. He had
yeah,
been with Company M. I forget his name now. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So there were, and if I'm in some of my papers here, there was a statement, I think it was from 1855, that was offering land to military men who decided to get out,
Hmm.
whose enlistment was faithfully concluded. Most soldiers, unlike the Hollywood, the John Wayne cavalry movies, most of the men did not reenlist. The vast majority saw the military, particularly the immigrants, as a means of, number one, not starving initially, and then getting a grub stake in the new country.
Hmm.
And I didn't get into it too much, but the Irish were the first big immigrant group that came in, and they were hated because they were coming in poor, uneducated, starving. It's hard to be real polite when you're coming in under that, you know, condition. And, that no Irish need apply and all that. Well, the U.S. Army was saying, come on in, we'll help take care of you. The Irishmen particularly were very interested in gardening, if you recall. They had a big garden at Fort Steilacoom, and the garden became like their big thing. For people that have been starving, growing your produce, and being able to eat it yourself instead of turning it over to a nobleman or a landowner, was probably pretty cool.